A new Final Fantasy XIV expansion is a special thing. This is a game that, by all accounts, should have been relegated to the dustbin of history, yet here it stands, beckoning its players to discover a new world and to experience yet another chapter in the story of the start. Yet a question arises: is this a tale worthy of introducing another 10 years of storytelling? The answer is more complicated than I expected it would be before embarking across the ocean to the continent of Tural. This is a comprehensive review of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. I will have to warn you that in order to speak about the game comprehensively, I'm gonna have to spoil this story, so do with that information what you will. As per my previous upload, which was a partial impression piece about Dawntrail up to the 5th area in the expansion, some of you might be aware that my opinion on this new entry in the ongoing saga of Final Fantasy XIV is low. Having finally reached the credits for the main story quest as well as the content beyond, I can confidently state that my opinion has changed, but perhaps not in the way that you'd expect. Now that the labor of experiencing the totality of Dawntrail's story is behind me, I can offer you a complete overview of the game's myriad facets from start to finish. Everything from the game's environment design to the soundtrack, to the story, its themes, its gameplay, we will leave no stone unturned in this review, so get comfortable. However, before we can get started, we have to thank today's sponsor. It's Audible. I'm just kidding, it's me. Writing, recording, editing, and even producing my own background music, it's a lot of work, so here's the pitch. All videos 2 days early and ad-free for $1 a month on Patreon. Alright, let's get to it. Far to the west is the continent of Tural, which is home to a myriad peoples of all conceivable shapes, sizes, and cultures, many of whom live together in the city of Tuliolal, which serves as the central hub of 14's newest expansion. As usual, Creative Studio 3's environment artists have done incredible work bringing this city to life. The attention to detail in the architecture of Tuliolal is stellar, and the density of colorfully clad inhabitants makes the space feel bustling and alive. With the knowledge that I'd be spending a great deal of time within the limits of the city, I was relieved that Creative Studio 3 hit it out of the park once again. As far as environment design goes across the entire expansion, however, my opinion softens. I understand that there are many 14 players who will be satisfied enough by the knowledge that the game drew inspiration from Central and Southern America for a majority of the game's zones, citing the importance of representation. I'll be honest, I couldn't care less about any of that. The first 4 locations of Dawntrail seem to lack that distinct quality of fantasy that makes many of 14's environments feel special, and while it's undeniable that the locations were lovingly crafted, they resemble their inspirations more than they should, perhaps a consequence of being too cautious when rendering these cultures in-game. As I made my way through the main story quest, I often thought about Heavensward, which feels like a very distant memory at this point. A thought occurred to me throughout my journey. That expansion also borrowed heavily from real cultures, with the most notable being its French inspiration, visible in the Gothic architecture of Ishgard and the names of its inhabitants. However, the desire to extract artistry from reality did not restrict the developers from providing us with a striking vista in the Sea of Clouds, for example. I often think of the mountainous structure jutting across the horizon in Thavnia, or the false sky of Labyrinthos, or the dreamlike castle standing in the center of a lake in Ilmeg. While the environment design in Dawntrail is exceptional in a few places, particularly during the latter end of the expansion, the first 4 locations do not measure up to the standard of quality that I've come to expect from Final Fantasy XIV. With that said, I was stunned when I first set foot in Solution 9 and Living Memory. These 2 locations stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the most memorable environments in all of Final Fantasy XIV, and I was delighted to move through those spaces. While most of Tural's locales were underwhelming, in my opinion, these shining exceptions make me hopeful that we can look forward to more striking, imaginative worlds to explore in the future. Now, I obviously can't publish a comprehensive review of Dawntrail without discussing its music, and as a musician with a professional history in both composition and performance, I believe that I am something of an authority on this subject. Historically, one of 14's unique features in the MMO genre, as well as in the broader gaming industry, is its masterful and ever-expanding soundtrack brought to you by the living legend himself, Masayoshi Soken. A master of his craft, Dawntrail should be considered yet another triumph in his stellar career, but it isn't without a few inexplicable blemishes. Our first tonal introduction to the expansion soundscape comes from the theme heard in the reveal trailer, titled Dawntrail. Like every theme since Shadowbringers, which is still the best one by the way, this theme features a mixture of disparate timbres. You have your traditional rock instrumentation, a distorted guitar and bass, a drum kit, and a vocalist, along with a gorgeous flamenco section featuring a beautifully crafted string solo that, in my opinion, evokes the feeling of playing as a viper. Where the piece begins to fall apart is with a sharp tonal shift in its third section, which is unique to Dawntrail's theme. Correct me if I'm wrong, but both Shadowbringers and Endwalker's themes vacillated between a standard rock timbre and an orchestral instrumentation, never introducing a third soundscape. Shifting the rhythm to the upbeat and introducing new harmonic and melodic motifs, the third section of Dawntrail's theme feels tonally out of place, which serves as something of a foreshadowing for some of the issues with the expansion as a whole. The first moment of musical dissonance I experienced was in Tural, which features music evocative of mid-20th century American swing with a dash of Dixieland. Its evening theme retains the jazz instrumentation, but it trades its blaring horns and its flat fifths for a more contemporary lounge sound. Not quite smooth jazz, thank God, but certainly not the New Orleans feel of its daytime counterpart. I love this music, don't get me wrong, but I just don't love it against the backdrop of Dawntrail's capital city. While I appreciate that Soken is channeling the traditions of the early 20th century American South, it just doesn't fit in Tural. With that said, it's still a fantastic composition independent of its placement in the expansion, and it's a testament to Soken's ability to explore various musical genres for Dawntrail's motifs. As for the soundtrack for the environments of Tural, it's absolutely perfect. I have nothing but praise for the themes across Dawntrail's zones. In particular, each location's night theme is exceptional. Astounding piano performances with little to no accompaniment evocative of the sensory experience of a Debussy piece. 10 out of 10. One of the soundtrack's greatest surprises is actually in its final location, Living Memory, which I would describe loosely as an oboe concerto. It's heart-wrenching, nostalgic, and perfectly suited for the themes of the story at that point. Where Dawntrail's soundtrack soars, in my opinion, is in its dungeon boss theme, which is one of the most important parts of a 14 soundtrack. While I adored Shadowbringer's theme, Insatiable, for evoking the urgency and desperation of that expansion story, I felt that Endwalker's theme, Finality, didn't reach the same heights. I was ready for Dawntrail to impress me, and in this regard, I was not disappointed. I'm a sucker for a battle theme composed in compound meter. Almost every piece of music I've ever heard in my life is written in common time, and I'm sick of counting to 4. This piece channels one of my favorite Final Fantasy battle themes, which belongs to Final Fantasy VIII. Composed in mixed meter and utilizing descending chromatic tones in the harmony, a Soken favorite, anything that sounds like VIII's theme is a win in my opinion, and Dawntrail's boss theme deserves to be considered among the best battle themes that has graced this franchise. Dawntrail could have been a contender for one of the best soundtracks in the history of Final Fantasy XIV, if not for its final piece titled Smile, which is played during the credits.
At the crossroads, standing here, not a star in the sky to guide me tonight. If we're lost in fear, deep in darkness, drown my cry.
I'm not gonna mince words, this was atrocious. The vocalist performance was not only unintelligible, but it was pitchy, which is unacceptable. The music sounds badly mixed, too. The vocalist audibly peaks, and the chorus has this harsh, high-end quality that tears through the balance of the mix. Not to mention the piece itself, which has all of the makings of a generic American musical. This is far beneath the standard of quality that I've come to expect from Final Fantasy XIV, and I never, ever want to hear it again. Perhaps the greatest sin is the ongoing issue with Dawntrail's tone. This piece follows a genocide. For the soundtrack to break out into a song that might be performed at your local theater's rendition of The Lion King after an extremely somber series of events is confusing, embarrassing, and quite frankly laughable. Overall, the soundtrack to Dawntrail is yet another amazing contribution by Soken, save for a few notable exceptions that sour critical moments in the game. Now that we've covered the world of Tural and the soundtrack of our newest expansion, let's continue our comprehensive review by getting into the meat and potatoes, the story and themes of Dawntrail. Final Fantasy XIV is often hailed as one of the greatest narrative experiences in gaming. I would have been inclined to agree at the time that Endwalker released and the curtains closed on the masterfully told story of Hydaelyn and Zodiark. Dawntrail represents the beginning of a new era for 14, so expectations for the narrative were softer than they were for Endwalker. Understandably, whatever new tale that Creative Studio 3 is spinning up will require years and several expansions to come into fruition. As the saying goes, Shadowbringers wasn't built in a day. Naturally, the community understood that it would be necessary to scale back the narrative intensity of 14's newest expansion, hence Beach Episode. The prevailing sentiment amongst the player base was, as I'm sure you've heard, you can't have a universe-ending threat for every expansion lest you become World of Warcraft. While I don't disagree, a story requires some inciting incident to propel the narrative forward. It needs compelling characters to breathe life into your world and to present obstacles to your favorite heroes. It needs challenging themes that inspire introspection or force a re-evaluation of conventional wisdom. It's my opinion that, all in all, Dawntrail falls short of the storytelling quality that I've come to expect from Creative Studio 3, owed in no small part to its tonal inconsistency, its shallow themes, its plodding pace, and its weak cast of characters, among many other things. It should be said that Creative Studio 3 actually provided us with 2 expansion stories this time around. We have Dawntrail, of course, which follows the story of Wuk Lamat and the Rite of Succession, but then there's its sequel, which follows the Scions of the Seventh Dawn alongside the newly appointed Dawn servants saving the Source from being harvested by Sphene in order to sustain her post-death society. Let's begin by examining the first story, the Rite of Succession, and our journey through Tural alongside Wuk Lamat. Having been recruited to meddle in a foreign election, the player sails west to the New World, the land of Tural, in search of adventure, or to fulfill an old promise, or to uncover the truth about one's heritage. With the added twist of Oriange and Thancred being recruited by Kona, the second promise, and the brother of Wuk Lamat, Dawntrail's narrative setup serves as a strong foundation, but sadly, the story that unfolds doesn't live up to its opening chapter. Awaiting the player is the Dawn servant of Tuloyolal, Galul Jaja, adoptive father to Wuk Lamat and Kona, and true father to the mysterious Zoralja, the first promise. The fourth claimant to the throne of Tuloyolal is the much-beloved Bakul Jaja, who is two-headed like Galul Jaja, but is not among his children. With the help of the various peoples of Tural, the sitting Dawn servant, seeking a worthy successor in his advanced age, prepared a gauntlet of challenges for the claimants to overcome in order to mold one of them into a leader who could steward Tuloyolal into the future. The winner will be whoever can find the legendary City of Gold. What follows is a lengthy tour of the continent and of its people, propelled by Wuk Lamat's mission to claim the throne over her brothers and the cartoonishly evil Bakul Jaja. I will be blunt, this story doesn't work. We have our protagonist in Wuk Lamat who seeks to preserve Tural and save it from the war that Zoralja promises. These should be the stakes for the initial half of Dawntrail's story, and any competent storyteller would understand that in order for the narrative to feel urgent, Zoralja should be both more capable than Wuk Lamat and should have a more compelling reason for the outcome that he seeks. Instead, Wuk Lamat is unerring, beloved by all, and never in danger of losing the right. As the competition begins, Krile approaches Galul Jaja and asks him if he has any knowledge about Galuf, her grandfather, who arrived in Tural in search of the vaunted City of Gold. The Dawn servant refuses to divulge any information, urging Krile to help Wuk Lamat to win the right in order to discover the truth. Thus, it is a narrative necessity for Wuk Lamat to become Dawn servant, draining any tension or surprise from the narrative at the onset. What remains of Wuk Lamat's quest for the throne is to simply go through the motions. Dawntrail is defined by inexplicable writing choices that either undermine the broader narrative or simply take the path of least resistance, missing every available opportunity to elevate the story. For instance, little is done to generate dramatic tension between the Scions, who were ostensibly pitted against each other in this contest, while never actually having to oppose one another, aside from Thancred sealing a cave exit during the expansion's first dungeon. This story was rife with opportunities to challenge and to strain the trust and companionship that has been built between the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, which would have provided players with memorable character interactions and a modicum of character development for 14's beloved cast, but it simply doesn't take advantage of them. Another example is during the Feast of Repast, when the claimants are tasked with preparing a dish that represents the history of the people of Yaktel. During this challenge, the claimants are paired. Now, you'd expect Wuk Lamat to be paired with one of her foils, the villainous Bakul Jaja, or her brooding brother Zoralja. No, she's just paired with Kona, the brother with whom she's closest, which is the least dramatic narrative decision that the writers could have made in that situation. By pairing her with either of the antagonists of the story, Wuk Lamat and the player besides could have gleaned greater insight into the motivations of her opponents. Instead, Nothing happens, Wuk Lamat wins, and the story shuffles onwards. Speaking of the villains of the right, Bakul Jaja and Zoralja are constant reminders of the narrative failures of Dawntrail. Bakul Jaja serves as a singular source of dramatic tension during the first half of the story. His list of misdeeds are long and they include theft, kidnapping, and an attempted mass murder with the release of Valigarmanda. We discover, of course, that he took these drastic measures to win the right out of sheer desperation for the plight of his people and to be worthy of the myriad lives lost in the countless attempts to create more blessed siblings. This narrative revelation was interesting in theory, but not in execution. There was no indication that Bakul Jaja's intentions were noble. The writers went to great lengths to depict him with as much malice as possible. He reveled in violence, subjugation, and his own perceived superiority as a two-headed Mamulja. What could have been a fascinating exploration of a character believing that any means, no matter how destructive, justify noble ends, ended up as a hollow attempt at recapturing the sympathy that characters like Emmett Selk inspired, only devoid of the masterful writing that forced us to question whether or not he was the villain after all. Zoralja is even worse. Serving as one of the true villains of Dawntrail, second only to Sphene, Zoralja's motives remain a mystery even after completing the Everkeep and defeating him in battle. Even now, the best I can muster is that he felt overlooked by his own father and crumbled under the weight of his responsibility as the first promise. Also, he wanted to demonstrate the folly of war by thrusting the world into war? I just can't wrap my head around it. Zoralja is a crucial character in the infrastructure of Dawntrail, serving as the game's second trial boss, but he is completely underdeveloped as a character, which made me feel apathetic during his somber death scene. Lastly, there's the Rite of Succession itself, which makes less and less sense the more you think about it. The winner is said to be the first claimant to secure the 7 keystones and find the City of Gold, but Galul Jaja himself states that the rite is meant to mold one of his children into the proper successor. It's a lesson, not a competition, which raises the question of why Bakul Jaja was allowed to participate in the first place. And what exactly was the Dawn Servant doing in the time between his unification of Tural and the Rite of Succession? What were the people of Tural doing too? How is it that Wuk Lamat, with her band of foreign agents, can stroll into these disparate societies and offer solutions to generational struggles in a single afternoon? It beggars belief that the Hanu were unaware of the etheric function of the boat that they carry around during the annual Ihihana festival, or that any other warriors in Tural couldn't have executed the weakened Valigarmanda, or that the Mamulja were so inept at cultivating their own lands that the solution to their practice of child sacrifice is an Amazon package from Charlotte. Worst of all, this underbaked, nonsensical tale nearly rivals the length of Endwalker. How Dawntrail manages to have nearly 22 hours of cutscenes while failing to take proper care in defining character motivations or introducing meaningful conflicts for our characters to resolve, or taking advantage of obvious opportunities to create dramatic tension is entirely beyond my understanding. As the Rite of Succession draws to a close and Galul Jaja names Wuk Lamat the new Dawn Servant of Tuliolal, followed by Wuk Lamat electing Kona as her co-CEO, Dawntrail's ongoing pacing issues emerge front and center, becoming impossible to ignore. We're shown the mysterious doorway to the vaunted City of Gold before we walk away and visit Shaloani, which is unequivocally the worst zone that Creative Studio 3 has ever produced in the history of Final Fantasy XIV. With a completely forgettable story and some of the most embarrassing vocal performances since A Realm Reborn, there's little to say about Shaloani other than that I wish it never existed in the first place. However, it is at this juncture in Dawntrail's narrative that the player is presented with the true inciting incident of the story. An unprovoked slaughter in the streets of the peaceful city of Tuliolal by an army of steel men, and the return of a spurned Zoralja who cheats death and murders his father in cold blood. Promising to be a proponent of peace, Wuk Lamat is faced for the first time since the expansion's introduction with an event that forces her to question her own philosophy. While the events of the latter half of Dawntrail were considerably more intriguing than the former, it becomes clear that the sudden appearance of the Everkeep in Shak Tural and the conflicts that follow all exist as a final exam for Wuk Lamat. Up to that point, the player has traipsed up and down Tural in order to learn the same lesson over and over again. We can all coexist if we simply understand each other. Ultimately, that is the theme at the heart of Dawntrail's story, so I'm glad that Sphene exists to challenge that philosophy. Can you coexist with an existential threat to your nation? The downside is, of course, that Wuk Lamat would have to be the conduit through which the story's themes are delivered to the player, which means that she'd join you for every step of the remaining journey. By the time I reached Solution 9, I had grown sick and tired of Wuk Lamat. It continues to baffle me to think that this character, who began as somewhat endearing but quickly became tiresome for her immaturity and her ignorance, had more spoken dialogue than any other character on the cast. Remember, Dawntrail isn't only about Wuk Lamat, it's also about Kryl discovering the truth about her grandfather and her family, and it's about Erenville fulfilling his promise to Kefkiwa, his mother. By the time that the interior of the Everkeep is revealed to us, it seems as though the writers had forgotten about that fact. To lean so heavily on one of the most divisive characters in the history of 14 was a gamble that I don't think paid off for Creative Studio 3. Nevertheless, the story of the people of Alexandria, of Queen Sphene, and of the Endless was wonderful, if not a bit rushed, despite Dawntrail's lengthy runtime. The concept of a post-death society merging into an industrial society and dilating time by 30 years is extremely interesting, and it serves as the perfect narrative fuel to propel the story towards its grand conclusion. Confronting the Alexandrian consumption of living souls to cheat death and the existence of the Endless within living memory was, without a doubt, the best part of Dawntrail, and it elevated the setting beyond its more grounded environments. Plus, the subject matter here is far more interesting than trading goods for an alpaca saddle, as the player is made to witness the beauty of living memory before erasing its people from existence, leaving behind an empty husk where there once was life. The latter half of the story of Dawntrail presents a corruption of the heart of Wuk Lamat's character. Sphene, too, loves her people, so she's willing to drain the source of its ether in order to maintain the Endless who live in perpetual bliss in the cloud. What should be an intriguing clash of identical ideals between the leaders of these two nations is instead a bit of an afterthought, owing mostly to the limitations of the structure of a 14 expansion. The existence of the Endless presents an ethical dilemma that could permeate its own expansion. These people are living, breathing, thinking creatures. Aren't they worthy of life in spite of the conditions sustaining their existence? The story's answer is a resounding no, as it rests on the same laurels that define the player's journey through the rite of succession with Wuk Lamat. Speak with the people, learn about their lives, but don't forget to kill them all. It's the last zone, we gotta wrap it up. There's a sense of imbalance in the use of time across Dawntrail's two arcs, with far too much being given to the right and not nearly enough given to the City of Gold. By the time we're introduced to Sphene, Dawntrail's ultimate villain, the narrative is stumbling towards its conclusion, and what little time we do spend attempting to understand her intentions pales in comparison to the time that we spent completing menial tasks in the first 4 areas of Dawntrail. Because of this truncated and sudden narrative shift into science fiction, what should have been an emotional and exciting final confrontation against the Queen of Alexandria ends up missing all of the dramatic notes that it aims for. In addition, we're treated to one of the worst vocal performances in the history of Final Fantasy XIV, which completely saps the intensity out of Dawntrail's ultimate battle.
Is this a rift in reality? Has she lost control of the power? Sphene, listen to me. I understand. I do. And I know that you won't be swayed from your course. But if there's truly no other way to resolve this, then face me, not as a machine, but as the real you.
By the time Sphene was defeated and the credits began to roll, I felt nothing, which is a first for me when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. It cannot be understated just how much of a total failure Dawntrail was in terms of vocal performances. While I have no evidence of this, I am convinced that the recordings for the Scions of the Seventh Dawn were improperly mixed, or perhaps not mixed at all. Additionally, there seems to be little rhyme or reason to which scenes were voiced and which scenes weren't. Some of Dawntrail's most critical revelations were relegated to silent exchanges between characters, while there were more than a few voiced scenes that I would argue simply didn't need to be. There were some standouts amongst the cast, however. As I mentioned in my previous upload, Luis Bermudez played the role of Kona like his life depended on it. He put on a masterclass in vocal performance, and it was a privilege to experience it. Without belaboring the point, I was extremely unhappy with Wuk Lamat's vocal performance. An inconsistent accent, unnatural vocal inflections, and a suffocating presence when compared to the broader cast, Wuk Lamat is a character that I hope is left behind as we move forward into Dawntrail's post-expansion narrative. Although, who am I kidding? With the introduction of the northern half of Tural and the territory of Shaloani, we were treated to an entire culture's worth of terrible vocal performances.
I'm talking to you, you old bastard.
Give me strength. For the last time, the investigation is closed. There's no refuting the evidence.
I don't give a shit about your evidence, you lying scum. You release my friends, or I'll make you wish you had.
Given the old western feel of Tural, I can understand why Creative Studio 3 would make the decision to introduce American accents into the world of Final Fantasy XIV, but both the quality of the recordings and of the performances were dismal, leading to one of the lowest points of Dawntrail for me. I won't speak for anyone else, but as an American, let me say this much. I never want to hear an American accent in Final Fantasy XIV ever again, and I especially don't want to hear it from whoever was cast in Dawntrail. While I hope that Wuk Lamat's subpar vocal direction would be an anomaly, there is a notable drop in quality across the entirety of the expansion. Aside from Wuk Lamat, the worst offender is the voice actress for Kevkiwa, Erenville's mother, whose line delivery is wooden, unnatural, and better suited for an English dub of an anime.
Everything that lives must one day die, and that which has died isn't meant to return. This is the way of nature. Mine is an unnatural existence, and I've suffered it only because I had to unmake this twisted mausoleum.
More Than Once was a crucial moment in the narrative sullied by these distracting performances which denigrated the quality of the Dawntrail experience. These moments, which should have overwhelmed players with excitement or emotion, will instead be forever remembered by one question: who allowed that to ship in the final product?
Our nations are worlds apart, but they feel so close. Who knows what we could have accomplished had we walked together.
Have you ever asked yourself what Final Fantasy XIV is about? I don't mean its characters or its plot, but its themes. What is the game trying to say? Once I hit the credits for Endwalker, I had an answer which some of you might disagree with. It's my opinion that 14 is an indictment of nihilism, a complete condemnation of the hopelessness that threatens to consume every soul that is haunted by his inescapable doom. It's a powerful message in a culture as steeped in despair and poisoned by irony as our own. Basically, your life matters, so give a shit about it. With a new story comes a new set of themes, but Dawntrail doesn't have the luxury of 10 years of storytelling to bolster them. It has themes nonetheless, and while one approximates an interesting philosophical conundrum, the other is rudimentary and comparatively thin. During the rite of succession, the themes are simple, elementary even, and repeated ad nauseum. We can all coexist as long as we understand one another. This is the lesson drilled into the player's mind over and over again as he wanders from one corner of Tural to the next. It's a shallow observation in what could have been an intriguing political story. Consider who Wuk Lamat is beyond her role as a shonen protagonist. She is the daughter of the sitting dawn servant of Tural, vying for power over a budding nation. Yet she has no platform or political theory behind her ambition. She says that she wants to preserve peace, which means absolutely nothing, yet we agree to influence the outcome of an election in a foreign country on her behalf nonetheless. Then, throughout her character development, which is mostly static, every encounter that Wuk Lamat has with another tribe or even an invading interdimensional society further cements her shallow political philosophy. We just need to understand one another, she thinks to herself as she extinguishes the lives of the denizens of living memory. If a greater theme could have been derived from the journey of Wuk Lamat, then I simply couldn't find it. Shallow themes for a shallow character, as you might expect, but 14 is capable of greater storytelling than this, which is why Dawntrail's core lesson is such a disappointment. It's political science for children. In living memory, however, the story begins to approach a more interesting thematic framework, although it rushes to the narrative's conclusion before the player could be allowed to fully explore its ideas. What does it mean to be alive in the world of Final Fantasy XIV? We understand from Endwalker that the soul is composed of two parts, living ether and memory. In Dawntrail, that idea is extended as we see the living ether of the slain citizens of Tural harvested to sustain the Endless, while the Endless themselves are devoid of a soul, existing instead as the memories of the deceased given life. This raises interesting questions about the nature of what it means to be alive in the lore of 14 and whether or not it was moral to kill the people of living memory. While there were plenty of characters among the Endless who insisted that their existence was unnatural and that the only proper course of action was to erase them, there were few opposing voices among the Endless who raged against the threat to their lives, none other than Sphene that I can think of. It would have been fascinating to explore that argument further, to see if the case for the existence of the Endless could be justified, but the game sacrifices the deeper exploration of this theme in service to concluding the story. Ultimately, Dawntrail is a story about the need for understanding beyond cultural lines. It's a noble sentiment, if not somewhat dull and simplistic. All I can hope for now is for the story to further examine the decision that our heroes made to exterminate living people in future content patches. With that, I have offered all of my thoughts on the tale of Tural, concluding the second chapter of this video. Let's end on a high note. It's time to talk about the gameplay of Dawntrail. At the end of the day, once the credits roll and the curtains close, Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG, and it is a damned good one at that. While Dawntrail's gameplay, from its dungeons to its trials to its newly released raids, is absolutely stellar, there are a few worthy criticisms that need to be said in order for this section to be as comprehensive as the previous chapters. Once again, Creative Studio 3 has demonstrated an inability to weave narrative with gameplay in the newest chapter of 14. With over 21 hours of cutscenes, Dawntrail likely offers about 2.5 to 3 hours of gameplay throughout the main story quest. There has to be a better way to deliver the narrative without restricting the player's ability to push a single hotkey. When the story is firing on all cylinders, the issue is easier to ignore, but Dawntrail doesn't have that benefit. While I'm not going to hold out hope that the game's next expansion will even the scales between cutscenes and gameplay, it should be said that 14 must be willing to innovate in this regard. More than once, I felt completely unmotivated to play the main story quest, forcing myself through it for the express purpose of making this video. Additionally, the way that content is disseminated to the player, for instance a dungeon at every odd level and 3 trials, could use some innovation. While most of 14's expansions begin with about 4 hours of narrative before the first dungeon begins, it would be incredible for Creative Studio 3 to surprise the players by abandoning its tried and true formula. What if an expansion begins with a trial before the first dungeon? What if dungeons aren't structured like neatly organized hallways? What if the story ripped away control from the player less often, inviting us instead to play through the game rather than being told what happens? As of now, the template that Creative Studio 3 has used and reused for the better part of the last decade feels less like a creative decision and more like a production necessity. As a player, I want to feel swept away by the experience of playing the game rather than thinking to myself, yeah, it's been about 4 hours, the next dungeon should be starting right about now. With all of those criticisms laid out, what Creative Studio 3 has left for us is, without question, the best suite of combat encounters in the history of Final Fantasy XIV. I have repeatedly praised Final Fantasy XIV for having the greatest visual indicators for in-game combat mechanisms in the MMO genre. There is little that cannot be discerned by a player who is simply watching a combat pattern closely, which makes 14 approachable and satisfying to engage with. While there's plenty of room for high difficulty fights which require external resources and strategies, an expansion's dungeons are, in my opinion, a far more difficult design challenge. They need to be clearable by the general player base while still offering an engaging challenge that scales the game's overall difficulty upwards without alienating the least skilled among us. Dawntrail threads this particular needle with flying colors. My complaints about homogeneous structure aside, every dungeon in this expansion gets better as you work your way towards level 100. In particular, the 2 expert dungeons that we currently have access to are easily the best and most enjoyable dungeons that I've ever played in all my years in Final Fantasy XIV. I used to dread completing my daily expert roulette during Endwalker on account of how easy those dungeons were, but the current dungeons offer a degree of variance, danger, and activity that demands the player's attention, leading to a far more intense fight. The consequences for mistakes are more punishing too. Many of the dungeon's mechanisms have a 1-2 punch quality to them, meaning that one error almost always leads to a second soon after, which is a quick way to get familiar with the floor. With this new slate of dungeons, the developers seem to be saying, you're level 100, act like it. And although I'm the type of player to dive headfirst into optional, higher difficulty encounters like Extreme, Savage, and Ultimate, I'm excited for the players who aren't interested in those gameplay pillars because the content that exists for the casual audience is more enjoyable than ever before. The trials too deserve the same praise as the dungeons, offering all of the visual splendor that you've become accustomed to from 14, while also introducing a higher level of difficulty for players to contend with. These fights are creative and demanding, yet never obtuse. Creative Studio 3 has struck a balance here between difficulty and accessibility that most other MMOs struggle to find. Finally, the newly released raid series excels on all fronts. The Arcadian is Final Fantasy XIV at its best, a fun and compelling narrative with the most inventive, exciting, and punishing raids that the game has seen so far. In all honesty, the brisk pace of the Arcadian storyline, which is largely incomplete so far, is a reminder that Creative Studio 3 is capable of crafting a lean narrative with memorable characters and dramatic revelations without all the excess that inflates Dawntrail's runtime. With Savage around the corner, I am champing at the bit to dive headfirst into those fights with my static. Even without Savage currently available, I am excited to log in and play the game every day, more so than I have been in years. While I'm aware that the concurrent player count will settle over time, I'm consistently shocked at how many people I'm seeing in the game. Crowds of crafters hard at work in the markets of Tural, dozens of machines and beasts flying to their next stop on a hunt train, countless fate farmers slaughtering entire species of wildlife with extreme prejudice. There is so much to do in Dawntrail now that the story is behind me, and I am completely in love. There isn't much else that needs to be said here. One of the benefits of a holistic game like Final Fantasy XIV is that it doesn't cannibalize its own content with each new expansion release. The game only gets bigger and hopefully better with the arrival of a new expansion, and I can confidently say that Dawntrail's contribution to the wide breadth of content across the totality of the game is the best in its history. In this regard, Dawntrail is a win. 10 out of 10, no notes. I've made more than a few harsh criticisms over the course of this review of Dawntrail because I believe that the product that we purchased did not meet the standard of quality that we've come to expect from Creative Studio 3. For a game that has inspired me and millions of other players to experience emotional heights that few other games could ever hope to reach, this is unacceptable. Not only do we, the game's paying customers, deserve better than a plotting narrative full of half-baked performances, but so too does this lovingly crafted world that many of us have called home for a decade. Dawntrail was a misstep. As a story, it was boring to experience, sparse in its gameplay, and childish in its themes. Where the game succeeded, of course, was in its combat encounters, which will occupy the overwhelming majority of my time with the expansion. In this respect, I am more than satisfied, but never have I felt so divided in my feelings about an expansion. I hope that we aren't witnessing the beginning of a pattern, but rather a slight stumble on the road towards another incredible saga that will rival the one that we just left behind. Whether we like it or not, this is the expansion that we got. In some ways, the worst that Final Fantasy has ever been since its relaunch in 2013. In other ways, and arguably the most important ways, the best that Final Fantasy XIV has ever been. While I'm not looking forward to seeing or hearing more of Wuk Lamat, and I'm certainly keen on leaving Tural behind for greener pastures elsewhere, I am beyond excited for all of the dungeons, trials, and raids waiting for us. Creative Studio 3's Encounter team is absolutely cooking with Dawntrail, and it is a privilege to be able to experience it. This has been a comprehensive review of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. I really hope you enjoyed it. It's been a massive labor of love to produce. I lost some sleep to put this together for sure, but let that be a testament to my passion for both the content and the subject matter. If you could please do me a favor, leave me a like or a dislike if you're so inclined, and make sure to let me know your thoughts about Dawntrail and this review in the comments. I do read them all and I respond to most. Don't forget to subscribe for more content about Final Fantasy XIV and the MMO industry at large. It would be a dream come true to reach that clean, even milestone of 10,000 subscribers, so do me that favor, click that button and bell before you go. Patreon, Twitter, and Twitch links in the description. Give those a look, but I have kept you all long enough, minding my manners, of course. Thanks for watching.